Welcome to the Community Development Podcast, a podcast dedicated to community development practice and approaches, sharing our learning and connecting the workforce. My name is Russell. Welcome, episode 52 of the Community Development Podcast. Before we get started with a trip to Scotland, not just to Scotland, but also maybe a trip back, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 years ago. A little shout back to some of the recent episodes. The last one was just a little kind of shout out, if you like, to the Caer Heritage Project, C-A-E-R, which is the Welsh word for fort. And the podcast I've been working on that's been hosted on the SoundCloud channel and lots of other podcast platforms for the NCCPE, the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement. They're hosting 5 episodes which are exploring and really digging deep, pardon the pun, into the Caer Heritage Project, which is around kind of co-creating not only kind of pasts and maybe reinterpreting the pasts in communities all the way back to the Bronze and Iron Age. It is very archaeological, hence the pun. I think that might be something we return to in this episode, actually, that kind of like reconceiving the past and what we know and understand about our pasts, be able to look at our present and then go forward to the future. But that's been hosted. That was with Dave Wyatt, formerly of Cardiff University, and I really enjoyed that. So have a check out of that. But as I said, it's not on this podcast, it's on a slightly different one. But episode 51, the previous episode to this, gives you all the signposting to that. I was with the Grange Youth Forum for episode 50 in Grangetown in Cardiff, with young people basically putting that old maxim into practice, being the change that you want to see. Really inspiring group of young people that kind of give me a little bit of heart and hope that there's people who are on the way up, a lot younger than me and a lot younger than my guest I'm about to introduce, who know what it's about, and they're happy to get a bit of dirt under their fingernails, roll their sleeves up and fight for their communities and fight for their interests. We went over to Derry in the north of Ireland. We were looking at kind of cross-border stuff for episode 49. Way back then, episode 47, and the reason I'm mentioning that is because we were chatting with Hannah Kitchen-Kirby and Claire McGilvery around making rights real, around this concept of human rights, but not leaving them in the abstract where they're things to do with courts and justice and things like that, but really anchoring them in the material reality of people facing forms of oppression, albeit in that context it was much more related to housing and housing rights and tenancy and things like that. And it was off the back of that episode that Claire said, Russ, I think you'd really enjoy speaking to a friend of mine called Stan Reeves, who's really into Freire. I think we touched on Freire because, again, this concept of living in poor quality housing as a form of oppression onto people. So, Stan,
hello.
Now I've got all that preamble out the way. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be talking about a connection to Paulo Freire and a great thinker. But like myself, we style ourselves as pragmatic socialists. So we got on that question of his problem-posing method. So he created a thing called the problem-posing educational system, in contrast to the banking system, where you just store lots of ideas in your head that are given to you by the state and then regurgitate them. The problem-posing method is, well, it's an old idea going back to Socrates, really. Basically, you need to critique material reality and say, what is going on here and what are the problems we face? So we shared that in the adult learning project I worked in for 32 years and community development for over 40 years. We take that question, what are the social issues that confront us? And then we say, what do we need to know more about in order to tackle these issues? So that's an educational response, the need to know more. But the question is also, what do we need to do in order to tackle those issues? So knowing and doing is part of the dialectic. A Freirean dialectic. We need to know things, but we need to do things. And I've just been infuriated this morning by a critique by some left intellectuals who are saying that it's a waste of time, all these people marching up and down dressed as frogs in America. What good does that do? Where's their program? Now, that's a fair critique, but they at least they're doing something. And the doing of something, the working together collectively with other people in sustained community action. Sometimes it doesn't even matter what the action is. It's an education in itself, particularly for isolated people. We're all so isolated from each other. People don't actually know how to socialize. I come from a very, very socialized background where people would look at you strangely if you didn't speak to them in the street. Whereas now, if you speak to someone in the street, they look at you as if you're a danger. So in my village, if you walk past somebody, and they would say, "Are you not speaking to me?" So I come from a different era, an area of socialized. So this idea, the Freirean idea that you decode the world and then you identify the problems and then you act upon them. So our project, the Adult Learning Project, was fairly unique in that it had two branches, if you like, the knowing and the doing. So for instance, just to give you an example off the top of my head, we would have history programs, social history, because we didn't learn any social history at school because we learned British colonial history. So we didn't learn any Scottish social history. So we ran programs on Scottish social history, but also there were things happening. So there was the state decided to close Edinburgh Castle to the public so that it could make money. And for hundreds of years, local people used to walk round the esplanade of the castle and round the environs of the castle as a Sunday afternoon stroll. That was a very common thing to do. So our history group chained themselves to the railings actually of Holyrood Palace and made various protests against the closure to the public of historic buildings. And if you like, the privatization of public space. So our history group, so that's an action that they took in response to something that they were learning about in their class. So that action and reflection, dialogue is absolutely crucial and central to Freire's thinking. So that's an example from our practice over all these years. But we should maybe go back a bit.
That, I think, is a wonderful insight into your well, obviously your background, some beliefs, your character. I love that stuff around growing up in a very socialized village, very socialized sort of sense of community. Because you're right. I mean, I think people are increasingly atomized, and I think that problem then is the problem that follows then is that people maybe trust less. They're less trusting of other people they encounter. They're less trusting of institutions, and I think that's a very sort of slippery slope to find oneself on. Tell us a little bit more about how you got into all of this sort of stuff, Stan.
Well, I'll start with the small towns. Again, it's linked to my connection with Paulo Freire, because Paulo Freire is very strong on historicity, he calls it. He's a great man for making up words. Historicity. He said, you can't have a liberating education without a sense of history. And but like everything else, there's a dark side to that. And we allude to that when we're talking about history, we say, be warned. History can be so interesting that you get lost in it and you fail to look to the future. So you must have historicity, but you must have also, and I'll be talking about this all the time, you must also have the other side. So the contradiction is one of the central ideas in Freire. So you always look for the contradiction. So if you have historicity, you must also have futuricity. So I'll start with the historicity. So the town I come from is developed from farming into a weaving town. And it's remarkable, it's still got over 100 weaving houses in this town. It's a small town of about 3,000 people. And so where I was raised, now the school I went to, the previous headmaster was a man called Alexander Anderson, and he was a Trotskyist, and he was well, he was called Old Trotsky back in the 1920s and 30s, but he was a socialist, and he was attacked by the state for his beliefs, and a great and intelligent thinker. And this is at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. And he had 3 children, and they each became the ducks of Glasgow University. And the 2 of them, William and John, went on to become professors of philosophy. And John Anderson became the professor of philosophy at Sydney University right until the 1960s. 2 of his acolytes were part of a group of philosophers in Sydney, and 2 of them were Clive James and Germaine Greer. So from this town in Stonehouse, that John Anderson's called the father of Australian philosophy. And so that shows you one aspect of this village. There was thinkers in it. A previous period to that, just up the road, about 3 miles away, in 1820, there was an uprising, and one of the leaders of that uprising was a guy called James Purley Wilson. And for sedition, he was sentenced to be hung, drawn, and quartered. So that's part of the radical history of the area that I come from, which of course was represented by Keir Hardie, the other Keir. And then one of the most important fathers of democracy in Britain was a man called Robert Smiley, who everyone, of course, will have forgotten of. But he was a great compatriot of Keir Hardie's, and he was the MP for Morpeth. And I'm just going to, this is from Larkhall, the town 2 miles from me. And he was the president of the Scottish Minders. This is the turn of the century. Co-founder of the Trades Unions Congress, president of the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, president of the National Council Against Subscription. He was a member which became the Council for Civil Liberties. He was a founder of the Council of Civil Liberties. And he was also a founder of the Save the Children Fund, a man called Robert Smiley. His grandson went and fought in Spain and was a personal friend of George Orwell, and was, we believe, kicked to death in a prison in Spain for his trouble. So there's all that history. And then, of course, the dark side, it's also a great history of sectarianism in the area. So I learned about that, the hatred of the other, the fear of the other, the demonizing of the other. You know, Catholics eat their children. Catholics are feckless. You know, I heard all these kind of stories going on when I was young. In fact, I could sing chapter and verse anti-Catholic songs that were going on. So you have this tremendous dichotomy in the community between radical thinkers and sectarianism. So that's all swirling around inside me. And then the other element, which I'm very keen to emphasize, and Freire talks about it kind of more obliquely, and it's the role of popular culture, the role of indigenous culture. And in its connecting people and inspiring them and lifting them up. So in this town that I was raised in was a very musical family called the Chammers. And there was lots of music going on in this town. So of only 3,000 people. So we had a world champion pipe band, which people would be part of. And the Chammers came, and they, one of them, the Chammers brothers, was a world champion trombonist. And they started up a brass band. And so there was a world champion brass band. There was 5 churches in the town, all with choirs. And the Chammers decided they would, because they were socialists, they decided to have a non-Christian choir. And they were joiners in a local firm. And this is in the 1920s and 30s. And they would sing at lunchtime. And from that came the Stonehouse Male Voice Choir, which is a group which is still going. They're still singing in the town. So there's the elements, the creativity of music. And it was a very interesting town. So that's, if you like, that's my background. But the other interesting thing about my background is that my father, particularly, was a very successful businessman. So I was brought up in a very working class area. But also, on the other hand, my mother's family had ran the local cinema, and my father was a manufacturing businessman. So what? As an old man now, I'm realizing that these are the 2 elements. My father was a pragmatist, an absolute pragmatist, to the detriment of sensitivity, if you like. And then on the other hand, there's all this kind of radical thinking and art going on, you know. So that's led me to the place where I think you don't have to just think about socialism, you have to do socialism. And one of the most influential people in my life was a psychologist, a woman from a very working class area in Govan in Glasgow, who gave up her life really to being a psychologist. And she worked with young men mainly who had fallen on bad times and were in Borstals, etc. And she said to me, she said, what you have to understand is that democracy begins at the dinner table. She's saying that, you know, like if you've got a democratic family, if you have an autocratic father that's ruling the roost, etc., that's what you'll be like. If there's room for you and your family to discuss and to argue and to come to conclusions and to agree together what action to take to resolve problems, that's where it all starts, you know. To conclude, really, before we go into talking about the project and Freire, is I'm a child of the 60s. So I left Lanarkshire in 1966 and was off and on really back and forward between there and London in 1972. So that period is the period of a social and cultural revolution in Britain, which is, it's talked about flippantly as if it's all sex and drugs and rock and roll. Well, I mean, I was involved in the Adventure Playground movement and community development through that. And it was an enormous challenge to establish thinking, the Adventure Playground movement. People were throwing up high-rise flats and putting families into them. And Joe Benjamin took over derelict bomb sites in London and created these play areas for children. And the basic idea was that a childhood without play leads to truncated human beings, leads to atrophying of creativity. And that's another theme that Freire is on about all the time, talking about creativity. And his another of his great mantras was curiosity. he's talking about the death, in modern life, or the crushing of curiosity, and the role of education in stimulating people's curiosity. Just a simple question that we might ask: what is going on in your streets and your community? Let's be curious about that. And so that kind of curiosity that was happening in London in the 60s was just absolutely staggering. For instance, I trained as a social documentary photographer in Glasgow, and then worked in London over that period. And I didn't have a dark room. So where did I go? I went to the new London Arts Lab, which was a collective where people had squatted in a print manufacturing place that had closed down, a printers. They still had the printers machines. We simply marched in there, took over the printing machines, and started to print left-wing material. You're talking about things like the International Times and these kind of things that were all going on. In that, they said, well, we need to communicate our new radical ideas, so we'll build a dark room. So we built a dark room, and we started to take photographs and document poverty and inequality, and that was all going on. And then the other thing that was the community art. There was a guy in there, Interaction. There's an amazing organization. Yeah, I think it's still going. Started by an American called Ed Berman. And they used to march down streets and gather all the children and have art making events. It was a remarkable period of time. But the main lesson I learned is about gathering people together, learning and acting together. So the learning without action is an empty thing, and collective action. You see, Freire talks about the banking system, but one of the key characteristics of the banking system, he calls it the discreteness of learning. It's an individual thing. You go to an educational institution, it's your education. Even more so, people now see it as a commodity. I have university lecturers where students will come in and say, I'm paying £20,000 a year to come here, and you've told me that I failed. I demand a pass mark. It's all about me. It's all about the thing. So whereas what we were doing there was we were learning in a collective, and through collective productive activity. And that's one of the themes that's come through. Community is not necessarily a noun. Community is a verb. Community is what we do. A group of people can have a latent community. They may be a community. They may live in the same place. They may share the same interests. They may share the same lots of things common. But they don't become a community until they act together. Collective productive activity. And in that moment, when you're involved in collective productive activity, you experience community. You experience it. Now, my connection there is with music. I'm also a musician. So put simply, the musician is an individual. He has to learn the tune. So he's going to play the tune. He then joins with 4 other people who will know the tune differently and who will have different relationships. One might play bass, drums, blah, blah. And then you create together something out of that. So the collective is only as strong as the individual, which make up that collective. So again, it's that dialogical thing that on the one hand, you must work on yourself as an individual, but on the other hand, to be fully human, you need to be engaged in some kind of collective activity. So these are the kind of ideas that I inspired me in the 60s. And will I draw breath there? And before
This is the easiest podcast I've ever recorded. I've had my feet up.
I'm such a blather. I can blather.
It's all brilliant. I think one of the things you touched on it there when you were referring to that process of almost like a reflexive process of education and learning that again Freire was really good on around. Yes, it's taken place in it's an individual thing for you, but it's within a collective context as well. He was very keen to make it clear that he saw education as this two-way process. It wasn't just these teachers, these lecturers filling receptacles with knowledge, I think was a certain like a metaphor that he used, but actually that process of learning, which I find a very simple way of demonstrating that is in Welsh. The word to learn is dysgu. The word to teach is dysgu. It's the same word because there's the same process. There's that reflexiveness taking place, which I love. You mentioned sectarianism. He talks about sectarianism and pedagogy of the oppressed in a much broader sense. I suppose the context that you were using it, that kind of Protestant Catholic thing, much more kind of narrow religious connotations, but he talked about it in that much broader sort of sense. And I do look around with the things that are going on in the world, and I just see that increasing resort to what I know or what I think I know, where I feel safe, where I can raise my views, inculcate others with my views, but a reluctance or a fear. And again, he talks about fear, freedom, that fear of opening oneself up to different views. And I think this is on the left and the right and in between, to kind of hear, well, what's going on there? What is motivating that? What is beneath and behind those particular views, those particular actions? And I think we probably need him now more than ever. And no doubt some of the other names that you've mentioned. I mean, I'll throw in myself. Raymond Williams is one of my heroes, an intellectual kind of sort of stimuli. He talks about community being that warmly persuasive word. Just because it says community on it, is it really in that kind of sense that Freire would say, well, okay, let's critique what's going on here. Who's building this community? Who's nurturing this community? Who's welcoming new people into this community and things like that? It never stands still, does it? A lot of this stuff that we're talking about.
It's about asking questions. The method is called the problem posing method. And that's what I think is missing tremendously from discourse in the Western world, is the ability to ask why. There was a crowd of people in Ireland called Trochra, and it was a Christian organisation of the liberation theologists. And the organisation's still going, and they work in Southern Africa. And they worked very closely with Freire and some of his ideas. And they wrote a series of books, manuals, if you like. They were called Training for Transformation. And they're just absolutely marvellous. And they're using a lot of illustrations because some of the people they're working with are not literate or not very literate. And so lots of illustrations and examples. But one of the methods they talked about there was called the but-why method. Left intellectuals dismiss it as simplistic, but it's actually simply beautiful. And it's just you interrogate the world. You interrogate the social situation by asking why. So in my situation, I was talking about being a child of 13 and asking, why do we hate Catholics? And if the Orange Lodge asked that question rigorously and pursued it, they'd say, oh, but they took our jobs. That might be a response. And then you would say, but why? You say, well, because they were starving in a famine in Ireland. And they say, but why? Well, because the British state refused to release food and there was no autonomy in the country, so they couldn't reorganise land issues. And then you say, but why? And then we did that by that series of questions. You're led into a kind of situation. So that leads me on to the other key activity that we engaged in the Adult Learning Project. So I'm really coming to the start of the adult learning project. And it's the Freirean methodology called decoding. And before you decode, you have to encode. So what we would do is you would take photographs, make films, do illustrations of the actual material reality in front of you. So simple things, we would take photographs of a street with a mother and father and two children walking down the street. And we would get a group of people to say, what's happening in this picture? Why? And people would decode it. And I use that example because in that particular photograph that we decoded, there's a small galvanized bucket in the photograph. And one of the key questions we asked when we were decoding, and Freire would have asked, was, what are all the things you see in the picture? So that's about objective reality, not what you feel, what you think, what your opinions are, what actually is in that situation, So somebody said, oh, there's a galvanized bucket in that picture. And you go, well, what's the significance of that? And said, well, that's an ash bucket. And you'd say to the local people, what's an ash bucket? He said, well, so it tells you there's still, in the 1970s and 80s, there's still coal fires in tenements, because that's a bucket for ash. And then they'd say, and what does that tell you? It tells you that it's a Thursday morning, because that's when they collected the ash, was on a Thursday morning. So why is the man pushing the pushchair on a Thursday morning? Why is he not at work? Would be the question. So this is, again, in the 1970s, where it would be stereotypically obvious that the man should be at work. And they say, well, maybe he's a shift worker. And then you could say, well, what difference does it make if he's a shift worker? What would be the conditions of his family if he's a shift worker? So people in the room would be able to tell you, because they'd experienced that. They would say, oh, this is, maybe he's unemployed. And now you have to remember, this photograph was taken in the 80s when there was 3 million unemployed in Britain. So we say, well, he's maybe unemployed. Say, okay, let's imagine. And then we would say, what do we need? Then we would that question asked in the project with this group of people, say, what do we need to know more about and do in order to tackle the issue of unemployment? So you've got a group of maybe 15 people in the room. What can they do about unemployment? It's a global issue. Well, the answer is quite a lot, actually. So first of all, they said, well, we have to learn about the economic conditions that brought about the unemployment and who's to blame. So there's a study program would emanate from that one question, from that one looking at that materiality, and say, well, what we could do is we could set up a centre for those people that are unemployed, and we could start an unemployment centre, which is exactly what we did. So from that decoding and then that education program where we learned more about unemployment, we then said what we need to do in the community is establish an unemployment centre. So we hired rooms in a small hall, and we ran 3 or 4 days a week, and we advert. So the next thing is collective productive activity. Let's make a leaflet. So how do you make a leaflet? We made leaflets. We leafleted the place, and then loads of people came. At one point, we had like 50 or 60 members of this unemployed centre, and we then developed education programs for unemployed people, so we got the unemployed people and said, well, what do you need to know more about? So people were talking about increasing their employability. They were also talking about political action, like we need to act together to persuade the state to solve this problem in a statewide way, not just us entertaining ourselves in the afternoon. But we also had a social program. So there was actually entertainment going on. And the left would say, oh, it was just time filling. But it's not, it's very significant, you know, the things you learn from being social and socializing. I mean, we continually through the adult learning project, people would come in to the project and join these things because of an individual interest. Well, I quickly realised that a lot of people who joined were not that socialised. You know, and people talk about it when we do reviews. How was that class for you? How did you enjoy the unemployed centre? We say, oh, it was marvellous because I've made so many friends. And that, you know, when we did reviews, that was almost always, we'd say, I made friends, I learned about economic conditions, I learned a new skill, I tackled inequality back then. But the most common positive review of our activity was the friendliness, openness of the organisation and how many friends people made. You know, friendship makes us all more happy. Friendship gives us all delight. And, you know, it's very important part when you're creating an educational and community development project that the opportunities are made for people to connect, because it's friendship and comradeship that actually brings about social change.
But there's a gender dimension to that as well at that particular time as well, isn't there? Insofar as, you know, men who, you see this with things like, you know, men's sheds today, for example, or, you know, gardening and allotment type groups, camera clubs, you know, IT clubs, variations like that. I can remember working on an estate in Wrexham in North Wales, and it was just like a computer building club, and it was men just coming together to basically nerd out, and I mean that most respectfully, in just making computers and like swapping components. I know nothing about how computers work. I think it's all witchcraft. Swapping this bit for that bit, and a drive for this, and a piece of memory, and you could see it was about computing. But it was a whole lot more than that, because some of those large industrial workplaces were where some of that social reproduction would happen. Some of that philosophizing would happen for men on the conveyor belt at the coalface, et cetera, et cetera. You know, for women, it's kind of, you know, maybe getting away from particular traditional kind of gender divisions of labour and particular roles within domesticity in the house and child rearing and so on. And I do get a sense whenever I read or whether I hear from people who were around at the time doing this, and I was still a wee lad in short trousers at around the time you're talking about, was quite how clearly there was some disruption, but positive disruption to some of those gender norms that were in place, notwithstanding what had taken place in the 60s a few years. It takes time for some of these things, generationally speaking, to some of these ripples, if you like, to feed through. And certainly when you talk about, for example, this era and the miners' strike, you know, the role that women played within that labour dispute, I've always found that incredibly powerful when I'm listening to some of the women who were around at the time and getting involved in feeding the striking miners. They were becoming politically aware and politically and class conscious as well. I find that incredibly fascinating an era. And as I said, you know, my connection with it, not growing up in a coal community, but not far from a community where, you know, communities where that coal was being exported, you know, in Cardiff and Barry in South Wales. My connection with it was just watching it on TV, I suppose, in the news reports every day, and not really being hugely aware of it. But there was some of those gender dimensions as well. I find that fascinating. Some of the pictures you shared with me, there's a good gender balance. It's not all men, it's not all women. There's a good gender balance, and I'm always struck by some of that stuff.
So we establish a Freirean education project in a working class area in West Edinburgh, and we invite people in to come and decode. We don't call it that. We say, come and examine the social issues in your area. And a few people came, and then we developed, and we said, what are the social issues we face? And we'll run education programs around that, and then hopefully some action programs, action outcomes will come of that. So that's, if you like, our process. Decode the world, run education programs, run action programs, and get involved politically at whatever level. And so, if you like, that's because people don't come into it necessarily at the first stage. So you might have an action program, which would be a women's dance evening. So you say, oh, my pal's going to that, I'll go to that. So you go to that and you say, and then the women will say, oh, well, we've got a women's history project as well. Do you fancy joining? Oh, yeah, I'm quite interested in this. So I'll come to that. So you see that all of these activities are going on simultaneously. So people in the community engage at different levels and at different times. But it is a sequence. It starts with a decoding and a learning and then action. So think about that. Images, the shape this hasn't got images, but we used social documentary photography a lot, social images, which we created as a collective. We had a social documentary collective for many, many years. Anyway, we used the images from that to people their social reality. Here is your community. This is what is going on. Anyway, from that photograph and some photographs we took mainly at the health centre, the women started to ask questions about what's in the adult learning project for women. As you say, there was a good gender balance. Now, it's also partly because the workers that started it was two women and myself, who were the key workers, and both of them with a tradition of feminist activity, and very committed to gender equality. And so one of the first things that we established was a writers' workshop, and there was quite a lot of women doing that. So what happened is out of that, we created a women's writers' workshop. And we very quickly began to realise that we need to create safe spaces for women, and that women should create safe spaces for women. So as the project developed, a whole lot of programs came out that were specifically for women. And so, as I said, we started doing social history projects, and so we would do general Scottish social history, and then we started women's history projects, and we had a women tutors who started that, and they just started investigating women. And one of the things they did, and you talk about action programs, they went down the Royal Mile, which is the most touristic part of Edinburgh, and they looked at everything there. They decoded. They realised there wasn't one acknowledgement of women anywhere. All the statues were men, and all the statues were landowners and princes and philosophers and all this kind of. No, there are no women anywhere. So this tutor developed with the class a thing called the Women's History of the Royal Mile. And so they started to do history walks. So they walked through the town, and they'd uncovered all these stories about women, particularly a woman called Elsie Ingalls, who was one of the very first doctors, and she established a maternity hospital. And so that and is a great female hero. Anyway, one of the students there was just an ordinary working class woman. She was really into history, and particularly Scottish history. She went for 2 or 3 terms in this history group, and then she undertook to write up all the stories that the women had collected about women's history, and she then published a booklet called From Margaret to Mary. So that woman went from being just an ordinary participant in what you might call an evening class, women's history. She went on to become a writer and a publisher. She subsequently enrolled as an adult learner in a community development degree course in Edinburgh University. So you're talking about that progression from decoding the world to learning more about it, to acting upon it, and to becoming critically aware, conscientized Paolo would say, and then taking on higher education and becoming an active leader in your community. Now that's just one story of one woman, and that story is enacted many times over within the history of the project, and it was simply because we had this commitment to knowing and doing. And it's the doing that really inspires people to grow. I mean, lots of people know things and people love knowing things. And I sit and watch the University Challenge and it's great fun knowing things, but you need to do something with it. So I'll just say one more thing about women. So I'm just looking at a programme from 2007, and there's a programme there in Scottish history. It's called Damned Rebel Bitches. That's the name of the programme. And for those of you that don't know Scottish history, the Damned Rebel Bitches were in the Jacobite rebellion. They were the women who actually were in favour of the Jacobites, but were married to British state commanders, etc. And one of the British state commanders called them those. He said we can't keep a secret because of those damned rebel bitches. So the women, having discovered this historical fact, decided to call themselves damned rebel bitches. That programme ran for, I think, somewhere near 20 years. It's been so it's women examining rebel women and finding out more about them.
I've got visions of I don't know, a little old lady going up to the desk at a local library asking for the book Damned Rebel Bitches and rather sort of straight-laced librarian taking offence, but there's something there around that. I suppose the black community, the gay community. There's terms that were used pejoratively of those communities. They then take them, internalise them, empower them, and use them their own. Absolutely, there's something very clearly going on there. Interesting what you were saying a moment ago about subjectivity versus objectivity and those use of those photos, because something that Freire says is around, the radical is never a subjectivist, and it's that sense that actually to be radical doesn't necessarily need to be the huge sort of steps or huge kind of expressions of power and force and I don't know, violence, or I don't know, whatever it might be. It can actually be quite a mundane action, but it's what it kind of sets off. It's that chain of consequences that it can potentially set off, some intended, maybe some unintended. Yeah, I think it's really, I suppose if someone's coming at this conversation has maybe a fairly elementary understanding of Freire, the way that you're talking, I think, is really hopefully is really practical and realised, and material examples of what this summer means. Because, as you said at the outset, he did like his big words and inventing words, and there is a bit of jargon to have to decode, as it were. But once you get behind some of that, or past some of that, it really does open a load of things. And there's any number of kind of academics and influences and philosophers kind of on and of the left who people find influential. I mean, David Harvey, I mentioned Raymond Williams, you've mentioned a few. Robert Owen, Welshman, who was hugely influential up in Scotland, of course, in the cooperative movement. But something with Freire is that encouragement to look at oneself, but not to do it in an individualistic way or some sort of selfish way, but it's just kind of like, know thyself, and then just kind of like through almost like concentric circles or kind of rings on a tree, and then look at those other networks that you're part of, those other interactions that you have with people, and know thyself, and to do it in that very collective kind of collaborative way. I find that really, really powerful, and you've given a couple of examples there.
You have to understand, of course, that one of the greatest influences on Paulo Freire was Erich Fromm, and Erich Fromm wrote a book called The Art of Loving. Now, for us radical leftists in the 70s, when we came across that, we thought it was a sex manual. We couldn't understand what's loving got to do with radical change. And that's a theme.
Another title that would shock that librarian I just referred to.
Yes, I'd like a copy of The Art of Loving, please. And it's a beautiful book. Eric Fromm's a beautiful man. And what Freire talks a lot about love. He talks about, being a Christian, he says, faith, hope, and charity. And without charity or love, we become as a tinkling cymbal or a sounding brass. And I find in the left a lot of tinkling cymbals and sounding brass because there's no love. They're so angry and so oppositional. Essentially, what I was talking about, that's what people felt when they joined the Adult Learning Project. They actually felt love for their comrades.
Yeah.
That's what holds you together. And that's
Yeah.
I'm going to an event on Thursday, and I'm going to meet some people there that have known since 1979. We're still connected and we still love each other. I'm just back from Brittany. One of the questions we said was, our society and our culture is very decrepit and it needs to change. Let's look at other societies that have done that or are involved in that. So we set up a cultural exchange between Donegal and Ireland and then talk about the liberation of Ireland, and in Brittany and the liberation movements in Brittany and France. And what they had in common was they had linguistic differences from the state. So we have Scots and Gaelic, and they had Irish, Gaelic, and Breton. So that linguistic separation was important. I'm still in touch with the people that we exchanged with in Brittany. And I was over there this summer singing and dancing and sharing love and drink with all these Breton people. And it's the same if I go to Donegal. We're all still connected. That might be a question for the left just now. How do we create loving situations in our organisation where we love and support each other?
I'm not sure that any of this fun and enthusiasm and enjoyment you're talking about will ever catch on, Stan. What about, let's look at this maybe from the other side of the coin. Were there any adaptations that you felt you had to make to some of the Freirean thought and thinking in order to pursue what you wanted to as part of the Adult Learning Project? Were there any maybe limitations that you encountered?
Yes, well, the major adaptation, of course, is that 90% of the people in Britain and more are literate. So Freire's action was to decode the world and get people to identify problems and situations and then write about them. The first words you learned were, so if you were in a community that made bricks, the first sentence you might write is, bricks oppress me. Might be your and it's local. So that was the first adaptation. We didn't engage in literacy work. We did to some extent much later on because there was already a well-established adult literacy program within the council. So we didn't engage in literacy work. We sought in some senses to influence it and make it more Freirean because it tended to be quite individuated. You have a problem with your illiteracy and you need to solve it. That's one thing. And the other main adaptation, if you like, was on the musical side and the performing arts. So, which doesn't feature so much. Although Freire was a great fan of, he always engaged with musicians and etc. And he was a big fan of it. So, just a kind of phenomena happened to us, which I need to speak about, and that is that you may or may not be aware, but there's some kind of appetite in Scotland to become an independent country, seeing that we're culturally quite different from other parts of the UK. And that's been going on all my lifetime and 300 years previously, but it certainly gained a lot of impetus. So if you imagine us in the 1990s, well, first of all, We were invented in 1979, and in 1977 there was a failed attempt to establish a devolved parliament. And so in the 1990s, there was a fervent of activity to establish a Scottish parliament. And people were writing papers, and there was a whole really popular movement. Just like history has always been written by the toffs, the aristocrats, until you had red brick universities after the Second World War, and then ordinary people used to write social histories because history about your own community. You know, toffs write about their own community, which is kings and queens, and working class people write about their own communities. So history started to be social history. Then developed a thing called the Writers' Workshop movement here in Scotland, and that was an enormous phenomenon. And the Writers' Workshop was very, very crucial in the development of the Adult Learning Project. It drew on people. So people arrive at a Writers' Workshop and they say, "I've just written a poem." And you go, "Oh, well, read it out, Margaret. Read that poem out for us." She said, "I'm not sure." She said, "I wrote it in Scots." So that was their first problem. What language should I use? That's a simple problem. You'll have it in Wales. Will I write in Welsh or English? Well, here, will I write in Gaelic, Scots, or English? And a lot of people settled for mixtures and maxters. But it's a really powerful cultural dichotomy. You know what you're going to do with that. So out of that, we started to, and also out of the need to celebrate, there was a lot of celebration. We started to think about music. We're talking about cultural identity, and Scots have got very, very strong musical tradition going back thousands of years. We're all really connected. I mean, some have been militarised in pride bands, etc. But it's a living tradition. But however, it's been kind of culturally invaded in a number of ways. So we decided that we would get people to learn. We said, Scots music is part of your identity. We had an investigation called Scotland and Its People, What's Happening to Us? And people said, Scots people are not comfortable with expressing themselves. We should have some kind of musical event. So we started a musical, learn traditional music, come and learn traditional music. So we recruited some tutors and off we went. The first night, 60 people turned up, and we couldn't enroll them all because there were so many of them. The next year, there was 120. And within 4 years, we had between 500 and 600 students learning all aspects of traditional music, song, and dance. Out of that, we started to run regular dances where all our learners could come together and dance and learn traditional dancing. And we hired the biggest hall in Edinburgh and probably one of the biggest halls in Britain. It's called the Assembly Rooms. And we could get 400 or 500 dancers in there. We ran that for 10 years. And out of that, we made profit. And we redirected that profit back into the music programs, etc. And that took us by surprise. We have, at the time that we set the music program up, we might have had another 15 programs running. And we thought, oh, this will just be one more. There'll now be 16 programs. And within 2 years, our administrator said, we can't cope with this. Our organisation can't cope with this. So we then had to do another thing that we've done, is we had to create a new organisation. And we had to write a constitution and become a charity. And we've probably created something like 15 to 20 separate satellite organisations from the Adult Learning Project. So that, if you like, was an adaptation of Freirean ideas. It came out of a Freirean investigation, but it was just about learning music. However, we did adapt some of Freirean ideas into the musical methodology. So the first thing we did, for instance, is most people, when they learn a musical instrument, it's an individual thing. You go to a teacher and you learn it. So learning a musical instrument in a group as an adult, but with maybe 15, 20 people in the group, is a completely different educational process than having somebody sitting at your piano and teaching them. You know, you need to learn how to teach a group, and they're all at different stages. And we taught to learn mainly by ear, and a lot of people found that very difficult. That would be one adaptation. As I said, the other adaptation would be the women's organisations, enact. They went on to do all sorts of things. So, central process of Freire, which is investigation and decoding, doesn't happen in all these organisations. They become more like convivial, and I'm using that in the Illichian term. They become convivial organisations. So when we established these organisations, we created constitutions that would ensure their conviviality. That was a very exciting process. The Adult Learning Project, the central organisation, has gone now. It's been gone for a few years. But actually, the satellite organisations are still going strong. So the Scots Music Group still got 300 or 400 participants in that. And then we have a writer's workshop called I Write, and that's independently going itself, and etc., etc. So for me, that's warming. It's nice to know, because I don't have anything to do with organising them anymore.
Yeah. But for them to be able to evolve and to sort of hive off and then become their kind of own independent entities and you know, take on decision making, you know, that in itself is a process of democracy as well, isn't it? And I think that's really, really important. We've been recording this, Stan, there's been a few technical issues, there's been some interruptions. I'm sure it'll all sound perfect and seamless. So I'm really grateful for your patience, not just your time. It has allowed us that to have a little comfort break and to put the kettle on. People listening to this will merely be listening; they won't be seeing you. I'm having the pleasure of your company visually through this screen at the very least. So people will hear your enthusiasm. I'm getting to see your enthusiasm and how animated you've got as you're talking. This stuff all still motivates you and enthuses you. The prospect of change, that things can be different, they can be better, they can be more just, they can be fairer, they can be democratic, whatever words one chooses to use.
Absolutely. Despondency is a terrible disease. I would have to say the miserable Scots are prone to it. The Presbyterian revolution here with John Knox and all that, etc. You know, it has a terrible impact on folk. But I see it throughout the Western world, really. A sort of leading left intellectual in Scotland running a project called Bella Caledonia just wrote a piece today saying, all these marches are a waste of time. I mean, I'm paraphrasing and being simplistic. He does say it does make people feel good for a wee short time, but you know, where's the strategy? And I mean, there is a point in that. You need a strategy to make change, but it won't happen without people coming together and people trying to be less bad-tempered and less despondent. Absolutely convinced of the power of the collective. I'm 75 now, and I've got a new project starting on Thursday. I talked about the Scots Music Group still, and the thing that I love doing now is playing music. I'm playing music for dance, and I've written a piece for the community development magazine Concept. I wrote a piece called Freire at the Ceilidh. For your poor listeners who don't know what a ceilidh is, it just really means it's a Scottish word for party. I mean, you all join together and there'll be music, song and dancing. Now, it's now come to mean a narrower definition, meaning just a dance of traditional dancing. So I've come to recognise that actually my natural constituency is no longer people in the 20s and 30s as it was when I started. It's now people in their 60s, 70s and 80s. So I'm starting a dance in the afternoon because old people don't like coming out. And people who get lonely and as I've talked about before, unsocialised, Further to that, I'll be using books of dance which were collected in the 50s. And you were talking somewhere and somewhere else on the podcast about decolonization, and we shouldn't call it that anymore, which I think is right, because once you've decolonized, what are you? Because people are so immersed in Western commodified culture that you take that away and they don't have anything. It'd just be empty. There's no films that. So the expression that's been coming forward, which I quite like, but it's a bit of a mouthful, is re-indigenizing. So that's what I'll be doing on Thursday. I'll be taking dances that were collected in the end of the 19th century, and I'll be reintroducing them to people on Thursday. There's one dance I'll be doing. It's called the Fuller Reel. And if you're a film fan, you'll know the work of Michael Powell. He made a beautiful film called The Edge of the World, which was about the death of a community. And it was based on the St Kilda story, how a community had to be evacuated. And in that film, there are people playing a set of tunes, and they're doing a dance called the Fuller Reel. The men in that film were in their 70s, so they will have learnt that tune and that dance in 1850. So we're connected, and I'll be teaching that dance on Thursday. And people, they won't care a jot where it comes from. They'll just enjoy that. It's a very pleasant dance, and they'll really enjoy it, and they'll be enriched and lifted up by that. Freire says quite clearly two things. He says, first of all, becoming consentized and having developing a critical consciousness by examining and decoding reality doesn't make you happy. In fact, it might make you miserable. And another thing he says, it's Freire's project with thousands and thousands and thousands of becoming literate through his action. It's an enormous thing. But he says quite clearly, he says, this is an education project. It's not going to, of itself, bring about political change. There will be times in history when political change is in the air. It's in the zeitgeist. And the people who've been involved in the Adult Learning Project will grasp the opportunity to become involved in that political movement. I mean, we're seeing just now an enormous swing to the right, and you can't really see where the swing to the left is going to come from, but it'll come. It'll come, and that's one of the lessons of history, and that's why I'm so interested in history. I'm been studying my own social history from my own small town, and the heroes of democracy that came from that small community are just enormous. And human beings don't change that much. We'll see some heroes of democracy emerging sometime soon. I don't know how they'll do it. It won't be the way I've done it. They will emerge. Sure.
Well, it's what Raymond Williams calls that long revolution. We've had an industrial revolution. We had it's like a print and a media revolution. He talks about a cultural revolution. I mean, maybe that was misappropriated by Mao to a certain extent, and some people in his vein in the early to mid 20th century. But this sense that people can just begin to, well, more than begin, they take control of their destiny. It's done in a democratic way, very much in the vein of how we're talking. It's critical. It's posing questions. It's forever looking to improve and to do better. It lives within its means. We haven't talked much about, say, for example, the environment. I don't know, maybe it's for another conversation, to what extent were green, what we would call today green issues, were they part of the adult learning project, for example? But this cultural revolution, this long revolution, in Williams's words, that is very much living within its means. It's not harming the ecosystems and ecology and ultimately the planet for future generations to follow and so on. I think sometimes the downside to things like there's many downsides to social media, but the internet and the digital technology we're using is the simplification or the reduction of big ideas into these kind of like memes. But he says, and it goes around and around, to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. Use the word despondency, and there is a lot of that around. And it is hard. It does feel very much like putting one's head above the parapet to go, oh no, look, no, let's try and find some joy. Let's try and find some levity. Let's enjoy ourselves. Let's lose ourselves in a ceili or a tumpath, as we would say in Welsh, or whatever else it might be. That's okay, without losing sight of maybe some of the bigger issues that are taking place. Final words to yourselves, Sam, and then we'll wrap this up and put a nice bow on it. And I'd love to do it again sometime.
Yes. Quickly mention the land studies. You talked about ecology. We ran a program for many years called Land Issues, and it was looking at ownership, access, and use of land. And one of the collaborators in that process was a man called Andy Whiteman, who went on to write an amazing book called Who Owns Scotland? And that's been one of the generators of the land reform movement in Scotland, which has kind of staggered on a wee bit. It could, of course, be much more radical. And it's one of the reasons why I've never engaged with British left organisations like, for instance, the Labour Party, which I would vote for, but was never part of. Because they've never addressed that fundamental issue of land ownership, and from that emanates all of the British establishment. And until land is reformed, we're going to have barons and earls and knights and kings and queens in the background now. But so we need to address that issue.
Yeah, because ultimately it leads to a hoarding and a concentration of wealth and things like that. So, Stan, if people are listening to this and they're thinking, I'd love to know more. Do you have much of a presence on social media? I know obviously there's the book that we've talked about and we've alluded to, Living Adult Education. So the version I managed to get hold of, it did take me a while, I'll be honest. It's from '89. I know you've got a more recent version that then encapsulates and covers some of the work that the ALP did in the 1990s. Does it come into the 2000s at all?
It does, yes. It goes
okay.
From about 1990 to about 2010. Yeah, so it's about 20 years it covers.
I'll see if I can get hold of that one, because that's a little bit more my contemporary era in terms of sort of the doing of some of this and some of the more. Yeah, I suppose as well, that kind of like post-university life, that wider consciousness on my part that I started to kind of realise. There's a link that you've shared with me that I'll put in the show notes that provides access, I think, to an online version of it, albeit if somebody might need an academic or an institutional account of some sorts to access. But we'll do our best to get that to people. I'm going to give a quick plug to a book. Ooh, what's the date of it? It's by Margaret Leptwith. I mean, anyone's listening to this who hasn't heard of her, be surprised. Crikey, this is 2016. I forgot. I hadn't realised it was that old. Community Development in Action. 2 words, not in action, 1 word. Putting Freire into practice. And that's very much Margaret's attempt to, again, I suppose, to go a little bit deeper into what we're talking about today in terms of power. Where does it lie? The politics, some of the politics that you've alluded to, very much more the electoral definition of politics rather than the everyday lived experience of what happens in our communities. It's not a biography of Freire, but it is very biographical in its nature as well. So I'd recommend that. He wrote tons of books, but I always suggest that people start with Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is 1970, I want to say off the top of my head. Has been republished any number of times by Penguin and so on. You mentioned Illich a bit earlier. He's quoted on the back of my copy, quote unquote, truly revolutionary. It's how he described pedagogy of the oppressed. Born the same year as Raymond Williams, so maybe there was something in the water in 1921. I don't know. But Stan, yeah, any final comments and anything you want to share by way of sort of contact details or anything like that? If people want to know a little bit more about you and your work, or come along to a Cayley maybe.
Yes, come to the Kerry, come with me. You will enjoy it. No, really, I've leathered long enough. But I came across an expression just recently, and it kind of spoke to me. Intellectual loneliness. I'm suffering from intellectual loneliness, not social loneliness, and a wonderful family. So it's difficult to find people. I think with all kind of identity politics and the individuation of things, it's very difficult to find people who are into ideas about how you might build collectives in whatever field you're in. So if anybody wants to reach out to me and talk to me and make me a wee bit less lonely, I'd be very grateful. And you just find me on Facebook, Stan Reeves, that's me, and send me a message. And
yeah, I can empathise with that, I think. Tuesday, which is the day of the week that we're recording this, is the day of the Philosophy in Pubs group that I co-host with my partner in crime, Jan. And Jan appeared on a very, very early episode of this around looking at things like community education, community philosophy, as a process. Again, what you said about community is not just a noun, it can be a verb. And so community philosophy, things that you do rather than it being something that you sort of just study or you read about, something you actually practice. Can't remember what we're talking about tonight, admittedly, but yes, we'll be doing that this evening. And I will be amazed if Freire and stuff that you said doesn't kind of surface again. So I've got a pint in my hand, and we've got going after 7 o'clock in the Royal Exchange pub in Llandaff North in Cardiff, CF14 something.
I don't think I'll make it, even
no,
if I'm very fast.
No, you won't. But yeah, maybe next week, or if you find yourself in Cardiff any time and it coincides with a Tuesday. But I suppose again, it's this. We use that word convivial as well. It's amazing how much of that common lexicon we have, given that we've only up to prior to today exchanged emails. And again, thank you to Claire McGilvery as well for putting us in touch with one another. Yeah, because that conviviality is important, because of course within all of that as well, and within all of what we've been covering, and I'm sure this was the case within the Adult Learning Project, it's okay to disagree. It's okay to have other ways of seeing things, or to say, I'm not quite sure. I don't think I agree. I'm not sure. I'm going to do some more thinking. That's okay. We've lost a little bit of the art of that, and that's what we try to encourage with the Philosophy in Pubs group and the kind of philosophy inquiry methodology, is to use a stimulus to raise a topic and then discuss it, and to come at it from those different angles that we all bring to it, because we all have those individual experiences of where we were raised, and you know what our parents did, and the school we went to, and what work we've done, and what faith we have or don't have, and whatever else it might be. But to do it in that convivial way that allows that space to disagree. Important.
Do you know of the work of Catherine McCall, Philosophic Inquiry? Check her out. She was getting school children to discuss philosophic questions, and we ran a program developed from that called Think for Yourself. A lot of our programs would have names. They would be called names in Scots language rather than a posh English. So we would have some, damn rebel bitches, think for yourself. We had a football literacy project called Glory and Dismay. So that was part of our approach. We'd use language that people would find familiar to them, even in the very title of the thing that we were going to do. So anyway,
Stan, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself. Again, thank you once again for your patience with some of the technical issues that we've faced. The sun has just come out. You can probably see it maybe just shining on my hand. I'm in my front room. So I think it's coming through your window as well. So maybe it's the sun shining on the righteous here. But I'd love to do it again, and all the best with the music, the Cayleys and everything else that you're involved in. All power to you.
You're very welcome. And it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to somebody that actually gets what you're talking about. And it's great, and it's been really nice to meet you. And of course, we've got our connection through the Welsh Valleys. My wife is a child of the Valleys. That's where her mother came into service from the Valleys when she was 14. So we But we have lost most of our connection there, but we'll maybe try and build that back up again. Yeah, absolute pleasure.